going. My name is Scott Miller. I'm the Executive Director for the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance. We're really excited for this first webinar of the fall season this year. And we'll be having a great conversation and hearing from Silvia D'Amelio, the CEO of the Freshwater Conservation Canada. And we'll be talking a little bit about Canada's freshwater future. We usually run these webinars once a month through the fall. Our next one is in November, then again in December. So please be sure to keep those in mind. And we'll shift. Oh, if you happen to have your mic open, please just mute for right now. There we go. Thank you. So let's start off in a good way. In a spirit of respect and reciprocity, the NSWA acknowledges that the lands within the watershed of the North Saskatchewan River are in Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. These lands are the traditional territories, traveling routes, gathering places of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, and the Dene, the Stoney, and the Nakota Sioux. It's also the Métis homeland and home to one of the largest populations of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. We recognize and thank the Indigenous people who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and whose rich histories and cultures and languages and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward as treaty people. We invite all of our participants to learn about the Indigenous peoples on whose land you reside, and welcome you to reflect on your place within your watershed, but also within the treaty relationship. It would be great if you'd be sharing in the chat where you're joining from today. So we are joining out of Edmonton, so Amiskwaciy, Waskahigan, on the North Saskatchewan River, and I always buck up the first part of it, Kasaskatchewan-Sippy. So please share in the chat where you're joining from. I think we jumped back and forth on the housekeeping. So just so everybody's aware, we're recording this webinar and we'll be posting it afterwards so that people beyond the people who could join at lunch can see it. We'd appreciate it if you could keep your microphones muted and the video off just for bandwidth. Zoom has been particularly troublesome in the last little while, crashing and things like that. So we don't want that to happen today. And please leave your questions in the chat. Jill will be faithfully monitoring the chat, and we'll be bringing your questions forward at the end of the session, the conversation. And of course, any feedback on the session, on what you've heard, any insights, please pop them in the chat. That'd be appreciated. All right, so now for the important part. Today we're being joined by Silvia D'Amelio. So she is the Chief Executive Officer for Freshwater Conservation Canada, which I'm told is not FCC, it's FC squared. So when I screw that up, you can remind me, Silvia. She leads the organization's mission to conserve, protect, and restore Canada's freshwater ecosystems. She's got more than 30 years of experience in leadership, in environmental conservation and nonprofit management. And she's committed to sort of achieving the solutions that we all want to see in the freshwater world. She holds a BSc in biology and a master's in natural MSc with the Ministry of Natural Resources in fisheries, genetics, and management. So she's a fish bio like me, has the same roots. So I very much appreciate that. And has worked with stakeholders and government agencies and grassroots organizations on the sustainable water use and conservation practices. So under her stewardship, Freshwater Conservation Canada continues to grow its impact through cutting-edge research, advocacy, and public engagement. So welcome, Silvia. I'm looking forward to hearing from you and then having a bit of a conversation sort of after the fact to where we kind of dig into some of the things that you might bring up. So now I get to pass the floor to Silvia.
Thanks so much, Scott. I appreciate it. Yes, so thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you, Scott, and your team for having me here today. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the organization and what we do to kind of set the tone for a conversation about conservation, give you a bit of a background. So you've got my background. As Scott mentioned, I'm a fisheries biologist and conservationist in background and somehow ended up in a management role, but it works. We make it work. But the organization itself has been around a heck of a lot longer than I've been here. So we were founded in 72 by a group of 6 anglers who were concerned not about loss of fish, but about fish habitat and riverine habitat. They were in Quebec, but they founded the organization eventually in in Toronto, in Southern Ontario. And then the organization grew from there very quickly, opening another chapter in Alberta and grew rapidly across the country from there. So the organization itself, some of you may know it as Trout Unlimited Canada. We recently rebranded a little less than a year ago. And the organization from day one has always been about conserving and protecting aquatic ecosystems. So that's the water quality, the water quantity, the native species, species diversity, and of course, the structure of river streams and lakes and how they function. Over the years and across the country, we've done a lot of different types of work. I know we're very much known for our trout work, and we'll probably talk a lot about that today. But in truth, the majority of our projects actually don't even touch trout. So we've done work, and we're currently doing work actually on bass habitat in the Great Lakes. And we've done work on migratory trout as well, cutthroat trout out on the West Coast, Nile Creek, in helping with migration routes and survivorship of fry. We've done work on fishways in the East Coast, looking at improving, in that case, brook trout populations and expanding their range as they're being depleted in the lower ends of their ranges. We've done work on a number of native species in the prairies, in Ontario on red-side dace, actually a minnow species, which I know is astounding, but they're really cool. You should look them up. They're one of the few aerial predators in Canada, fish aerial predators. They have big mouths like tarpon, so they're just a really cool species to look up. So the organization is very much focused on conservation across the country. We are structured in a way that connects community with conservation. And so we have a number of chapters across the country. The number ebbs and flows depending on needs and depending on what's happening in the world at that time in the community. And those chapters, those groups of volunteer members, address local watershed issues with the support, technical support, and administrative support of the organization. And so I think right now the number varies, but we've got just over 20 chapters across the country, and more growing, more and more joining us sort of every few weeks. The kind of work we do is interesting. I get asked a lot about exactly what work is it that Freshwater Conservation Canada, or formerly Trout Unlimited Canada, does. And the truth is we do a bit of everything. So typically when we go to a watershed, we evaluate where the issues are and we try to address those issues. And what I'm really proud about with this organization, and I think this speaks to a need for conservation moving forward, is this organization doesn't treat symptoms. It treats causes of symptoms. So if we've got an eroded bank, we don't just plant the bank. That's probably the last thing we do. We need to figure out why that erosion is happening. If a population of fish is dying or gone, we don't just stock them back in. We need to figure out why they're gone. Why are they not there? Why is that population not thriving or growing? And how do we fix that problem first? And so this is very much a solutions-based organization and a cause-based organization. We need to figure out what the causes of the problem to make sure that the work that we do is sustained. In today's day and age in conservation, no one can stay on projects forever. There's too many projects to do and there's too many things to fix. And so it's really incumbent on us as individuals to make sure that the work we do stands the test of time, that it's self-sustaining and that it is impactful over time and allows a river, stream, or lake to continue doing that important work itself. So on that note, back in the day, as every good fisheries biologist, we built fish habitat, right? We built lunker structures. Scott, you might remember those lunker structures and undercut banks and all these fun places for fish to live. And what we've learned over the many decades, hard to say many decades now in my career, but what we've learned over the many decades is that it's much more sustained and it's much more it's a much better use of resources if we can help a river, stream, or lake get back to a natural state, a natural equilibrium where it can adjust itself. I think we can all admit Mother Nature does a better job than we do every time. So if we can just help those river streams and lakes get to a place where they have the momentum, the energy to carve out what they need, literally carve out um, bends and banks and pools the way it needs to, it will build better banks and pools and riffles than we can ever as engineers, professionals, biologists, hydrogen morphologists, all the professionals. So what we tend to do is bring all those professionals together and we push a river, stream, or lake towards that end goal of its own sustainability. It's complicated. Um, it's very much experimental at times, but highly productive. And we've been very pleased to see the return of native species in areas where they've been extirpated as a result of the work. We've been really pleased to see improved water quality, improved water retention at times of drought. We've been pleased to be able to connect community with these events and these successes to receive and realize long-term goals and long-term sustainability. So in case you can't tell, I'm very, very passionate about the organization and the work we do. I will put a plug in and say that this organization has some of the most dedicated staff, committed staff in making sure that we see change on the landscape, which is really important because that is the mandate of the organization. This organization, every organization is a little bit different. But this organization's legal mandate is physical change on the ground. So while we do a little bit of advocacy here or there, we're not lobbyists, we're not registered lobbyists, and we're not an advocacy organization. We're not a research organization, and we're not an education institution. But what we do is work on the ground, and we partner with everyone else to get that holistic approach towards conservation. So I've covered a lot there. Scott, is there anything I'm missing before we get into a bit of a discussion?
I don't think so, but I mean, I've written down a whole bunch of things that sort of, avenues we can go down with the
Great.
conversation. It sounds like the challenge has maybe morphed over time, like the challenge that Trout Unlimited and now FC Squared, same organization, set out to undertake has changed over time. So then what would you see as the biggest challenge facing freshwater conservation today?
Yeah. First, let me address that change over time. The change over time is really interesting because while it has changed, and I mean, when I started my career, invasive species were a thing, but not a big thing. And endangered species was a thing, but not as big a thing as it is right now. Climate change, all of these issues have come to the forefront and grown in intensity. But interestingly enough, the mandate of the organization hasn't changed since 1972. Which says that we still have a big job to do. We've never solved the problem, right? As a community, I don't expect the organization to solve the problem of conservation in Canada, but that we have a long road ahead of us, and that the challenges are mounting.
Yeah.
So what's the biggest challenge? That's really tough. Um, I actually believe that the biggest challenge that we're facing is actually from a societal perspective. So we have politics now in Canada that are focused more on consumption and economic growth than sustainability, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We need that in our community, but if we don't balance it out with sustainability and our connection with our ecosystem, we run into challenges. The interest in environment and the concern for environment in Canada is very cyclical, and we are very much on the downside of that cycle. And unfortunately, we don't kind of gain momentum when we come back up. We just come back to where we were before. So we're not seeing that gain in momentum and the reduction in destruction of our ecosystems and erosion of our ecosystems, and that becomes a challenge in supporting Canadian communities.
Does that does that sort of perspective, would you say it's consistent across the country, or does it show up in different ways depending on where you are? And I'm thinking of like in a Western province like Alberta, where we have, a fair bit of development versus say Eastern provinces. Is there a fundamental difference, or is it kind of
Yeah, I think there are some things that are the same. So, when it comes to the societal side of it, the distrust of science, that mounting distrust of science, that's ubiquitous. We're seeing that to a degree everywhere. But there are things that are more significant here in Alberta, and I think the focus on economy and consumptive use of our ecosystems is a little bit more prevalent here, and that I think that's partially because of, governments differ across the country, but also because in Alberta we are naturally, just because of where we are geographically, water poor. And so our watersheds, particularly our river watersheds, have to work a lot harder than the average river or stream across the country.
Right,
And so we're sort of at the bleeding edge of conservation here in Alberta, right? As a result.
right. Do you then start taking different approaches, I would say, to address some of those uh, sort of not behavioral issues, but the societal issues like distrust in science. So how would you say have you adjusted your approach to things, or have you?
Um, yeah, yes and no. So obviously the approaches from the on-the-ground conservation work differ from community to community. The education side of it, so how we reach out to people, does differ from community to community. The conversation that you have with Albertans about conservation versus the conversation you have with, let's say, folks from New Brunswick is very different because their concerns are different, but also their stressors are fundamentally different, right? And so the conversation has to shift according to the pressures that people are feeling, but it all stems or it all comes back to linking people back to their ecosystem,
Right.
right?
So then do you start leaning on some of the natural assets, like I guess there's a tendency now to start, and we're looking at it as well at NSWA, is this idea of looking at the services and benefits provided by
Yeah.
nature with an economic lens, not to put a value on them, but to at least be able to compare apples to apples. Is that something that's sort of top of
It
what
is.
being integrated into how you're working?
It is because, one of the fundamental challenges with the environment. Listen, this is the reason why we're always jealous of, the charities that work in the social sector or in education or in healthcare. Because in those areas, people feel it day to day, right? We understand the impact of, losses in education day to day. If you've got kids, you've got nieces and nephews, you see it. You see it day to day. Healthcare is the same thing. There is no one that isn't touched by an individual, or if not themselves, that have had major health problems. But
Yeah,
when it comes to environment for us is, in Western Canada, it's the mountains out our window that we go and recreate in the weekend. And that's sort of what's front of mind. It's not every time we turn on the tap to brush our teeth. Those are our rivers, streams, and lakes that are providing, and groundwater reservoirs, more so in other parts of the country, that are
yeah,
providing that water. And what happens if those rivers, streams, or lakes dry up? It is possible, right? And so we're not connected. We don't recognize that our sewage is carried away by those water bodies. That industry is fueled by those water bodies. We wouldn't have clothes. We wouldn't be able to drink our lattes in the morning. None of that would exist, right? And so what we don't do is we don't fundamentally understand that we are part of the ecosystem. And if, those heart and lungs of those rivers, streams, lakes, watersheds isn't pumping, we have a fundamental problem. And so I
right.
think that's the big shift that needs to happen. And it stems from education to conversations around conservation to politics. It's all sides.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not necessarily a shift in mindset. It's just adding I see it as another set of tools to have the same kinds of conversations and achieve the same outcomes. Like you said, since
Mhm.
was it the 70s, like,
Yes.
okay, we're still working on the same things.
Yep.
So your organization works with a lot of communities. Obviously, clearly you have a lot of different chapters. Um, is there an example of a project or an initiative that sort of just stands out as, wow, that this is making a difference, and it's like
Yeah.
the marquee banner of community engagement?
Well, that's really hard. Come on. It's really tough because I would say over 90%, 95%, over 90% of our projects require, based on our values, community engagement. And so, the majority of our work, even today, our team, this office is empty today because everyone's out at fish rescue along with 40 volunteers rescuing fish. And so everything we do really does have that community component and volunteer component. But I think what I'd really like to highlight is our chapter in Edmonton, the Northern Lights Fly Fishers chapter. And they've been doing work actually in the North Saskatchewan, most recently from 2022 to now. They've been doing a walleye study and looking at the viability, the catch and recapture rate of walleye from a management perspective. So sometimes the work we do in conservation relates to gathering information to advise management and not necessarily physical change. And so they've been doing a lot of work there and have actually identified an extremely high recapture rate, which makes that walleye population highly vulnerable
Yeah.
to mortality from angling. And so, now this information can be used to help advise management in the province, which hopefully will lead to regulations that will maintain the population, ensuring that, everyone can enjoy that population and that those walleye can serve the role they need to serve in the ecosystem in that food web.
Right. In a lot of ways, North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance tries to do the same thing, is tries to provide that insight for decision makers, whether that's, provincial management, in this case, like fisheries, or a municipality in terms of bylaws and things like that.
Exactly.
How does the sort of the chapter approach, I guess, work in terms of do chapters, and it's a new concept for me because we don't kind of work that way.
Mhm.
Do chapters have a sort of a singular focus? Do they work across chapters? Like what's the dynamic amongst chapters?
Yes, all the above. Um,
Next question. Yeah.
so, chapters vary, and we don't like to put too hard a box on volunteers working together to try and make a difference. So we have some chapters that have a singular focus, that maybe a smaller chapter that have realized an issue in a watershed that they want to address, and they go and address that. The Northern Lights chapter is a really great example of a chapter that's addressing challenges in multiple watersheds. They've been around a long time. They were our second chapter formed, so they've been around since the 80s. It's a large chapter of volunteers, which, by the way, always looking for more volunteers. So if you're in the area and you're interested, do sign up for that chapter. And they do a broad a broad array of work across different watersheds. And then we have some chapters who sort of cross-pollinate, who partner on projects that sort of in areas of overlap. We see that on the Grand River in Ontario, massive watershed that's about the size of Prince Edward Island, and I think we have 3 chapters on that, so they're bound to overlap at some point in time. And they do a really great job of working together on larger issues and larger projects as well. So it really varies based on the volunteers and their location and the issues at hand.
Are chapters guided by, so you've mentioned sort of the technical support provided by sort of the mother organization. Does that also extend, say, to strategic direction so that everybody's growing in the same direction? Or how does that sort of organization to chapter piece work?
Great question. So the organization provides sort of the boundaries, right? And that's just the nature of a charitable organization. So all chapter work needs to support the mandate of the organization, was to conserve and protect and restore Canada's freshwater ecosystems and their cold water resources. It's a pretty broad mandate. So it's really up to the chapters to identify those issues in their watershed that need work, and that those projects help support the mandate. And then the requirement is that the work they do follows our values and our policies, right? So policies
Nice.
around native species protection and all of those pieces.
I like it.
Mhm.
Um, can you tell me a little bit about the Alberta Native Trout Collaborative?
Yeah, it's an amazing collaborative. If you haven't seen it, anyone on the call, go to their website. It's absolutely amazing. It is a collaborative of organizations that is doing work to enhance, protect, and educate the public about native trout in Alberta. So there's been it ticks all our boxes, which is why we're really excited about it. We have a policy on prioritizing the protection of native and endangered species in Canada and working towards their stabilization or enhancement. And also one of our values is one of our top values is working with other organizations, partnering and working with community. And so this is a really great initiative, partially funded by the federal government to help stabilize and bring back native trout, particularly in the foothills. So a lot of work has been done on the ground work, a lot of workshops. There's been community events, a lot of educational opportunities, and I'm sure probably 90% of the people on the call have the stickers on their water bottles or books somewhere. So yeah, it's a phenomenal initiative that's actually really seen gains in the protection and enhancement of those populations.
I like it. I know we plug into it as often as we can, acknowledging that the foothills and the sort of the trout habitat is all kind of representative of that more pristine habitat, more unaltered. Although if you've seen the landscape, it's pretty
For
altered.
now.
Upstream of Edmonton, so it's from our various assessments, it's the healthiest part of the watershed up there.
Yes.
Do you see a difference between sort of and I'm thinking now of the Alberta context where we kind of have that sort of foothills forested landscape versus prairies? Like, are we, when we get into sort of the flatter ground and fundamentally different kinds of issues, different fish, for instance, big differences in fish.
Yes.
How would you characterize some of those differences that you're seeing?
That's tough. The further we get into sort of southern Alberta and the prairie landscape of Alberta, I think the more pressure, the more immediate, not the more pressure, the more immediate pressure those fisheries are under.
Yeah.
It's they're not to say there aren't significant pressures in the foothills. There absolutely is. But those are building pressures, if that makes sense. And so I kind of look at the prairie landscapes as where we're headed if we don't sort of get on top of things. The water bodies in the prairie landscapes are certainly under high pressure and are feeling the impacts of climate change at an extreme level, for
Right.
sure. And given that it's already water poor, the number of stakeholders at the table to take water, to recreate, to is even higher.
Right.
And so, yeah, it is a fundamentally different conversation, different stressors, and different solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then let's layer on the drought conversation because
Sure.
we've been having sort of drought training, drought webinars. We've been talking about multi-year drought in multiple contexts, Indigenous versus Western. How is it showing up? And I guess I know how it's probably showing up in your work, but how is it changing how you're approaching work? Or
Is making life a lot more complicated. Um, yeah, at the water body level, at the level that staff are working to make physical change on the ground, it just makes things more and more challenging and the need to find new solutions. And so I'm sure you've seen the beaver dam analogs, the post-assisted log structures that we've been building. Those techniques are an effort to help keep water on the landscape. And some of those techniques with the beaver dam analogs, for example, we're putting those in places where there isn't even necessarily water on the landscape year round. We're not talking about fish habitat here. What we're talking about is slowing water on the landscape and getting it back in the ground to help feed the ecosystem, to help, keep grasses growing a little bit longer, help feed trees and shrubs and that entire ecosystem and keep water in the ground. And we've seen some really great gains there. So really it's about finding new techniques. It's about solving the problem that exists on the landscape, not necessarily the symptoms that we're seeing alone. So yeah, the techniques change, the conversations also change, and I think, if we move up from the on the ground work, one of the things that we do need to talk about is the management of resources at an ecosystem scale. So right now, fisheries are managed, by one department, and water's managed over here, and grazing is managed over here, and resource extraction is over here. But until we can actually get all of those aspects of our ecosystem managed together, we're not going to be able to functionally address the issues that are happening on the landscape right now.
so when you're talking about that sort of multi department or whatever approach, are you referring specifically to Alberta, or is that sort of an issue that's popping up across the country?
Yes, and yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So then are there places that do it better? Is there a model we can look to that might be helpful or informative in that space?
I think there are some jurisdictions in Europe that have, I'd say, gone out on a limb and looked at things slightly differently. I think Europe is a little bit more nimble than we are when it comes to changing the way they approach environmental conservation and management, mainly because they have the pressure to do so. I mean, population density and infrastructure density is so high, they're at a point where they have no choice but to be
Yeah.
nimble and find something that works. Um, Here we're not quite as nimble, and we certainly don't typically in Canada look to other jurisdictions as much to try and find some solutions. So there are opportunities. It's just a matter of having the will to go there and look at things a little bit differently. It's a big shift.
Right. Yeah. But I think the the chapter volunteer type approach is one way to really not necessarily bridge those new approaches, but at least get some momentum in
It
different
is.
places. When we're talking about sort of these sort of new conditions like drought and things like that, are you seeing some tools or approaches that are more effective than others in getting the conversation going, I guess, towards that naturalized flow, like letting the landscape work?
Yes. I think again, the conversation really depends on where you are and what the stressors are for communities. And so those conversations vary
Yeah,
depending on where you are. But the underlying theme of all of that is taking a longer term view, right? We take a very short term view. It doesn't help that our political cycle is relatively well, extremely short if you consider, an ecosystem cycle. And so that ability to take a longer term view and make longer term investments for gains is the toughest conversation to have.
right. Okay. Where my thinking went
Mhm.
was into the jobs portion. So, I mean, you talked about where communities are coming from, what the top pressures are. And I'm thinking of, small towns that are trying to grow just so they can stay a small town. What do you think is the jobs potential in the environment world? It's it seems like we have some new tools that could really open up.
Yeah.
Um, I don't want to use the words green economy because that's not what I'm talking about. It's actually just people, the direction we want to go, which is actually more natural, more naturalized, restoring, places that have been impacted. It seems like to me at least, there's a growth opportunity for jobs and expertise. And I'm curious what your thoughts are of
There's a
that.
massive opportunity.
Yeah,
Yes. There's a massive opportunity for growth and jobs. There's a ton of work to do. The challenge is who's funding it. And what we're seeing over and over and over again is, with governments doing less and less and charities picking up the slack, and whether that's in environment or social or health, it's all the same. Um, Charities are picking up that slack without the funding to do so.
right,
And so there's a huge opportunity as soon as we decide as a society, as Canadians, that this is fundamental, that protecting our ecosystem, and I'm including us in the broader ecosystem, that protecting this ecosystem is critical. I think one of the biggest benefits we could have is actually looking at the environmental side of it in every single position. And so, if you're talking about utilities, if you're talking about, making sure providing water to a community and not just looking at how do we get the water, where does it come from, and how do we pipe it to people's homes, but what's the sustainability of that water source and how do we protect it and enhance it, and where else, what other strains are on that water source to make sure that we have long-term sustainability. And so I think, yes, there's huge opportunities. There's lots of work to get done if there's funding to do it, to get people on the ground making positive change to our ecosystems. But at the same time, we have to integrate it into all the jobs we do in building our communities, and sustaining our communities.
Yeah, I think you and I are on the same page. Like, I think
Absolutely.
there's, I think it's exciting. I see it as an exciting time. I just wish others would see it as an exciting time as well, and not sort of fall prey to the labeling, like, well, environment. Well, yeah, that's off to the side.
Exactly.
So I'm gonna maybe pivot back down because we've been talking sort of big picture. I'm kind of curious um, to talk about some sort of stream specific things,
Sure.
sort of stream level specific things, and I'm curious about the Reconnecting Canada program.
Yes.
Share what you will.
The Reconnecting Canada program. It is a program to reconnect severed habitats across Canada. And so this involves everything from culvert and dam replacements to dealing with thermal barriers to movement, dealing with um, water quality barriers to movement, anything that stops movement of animals, not just fish, but we've done work that improves, turtle migration, but anything that connects habitats. So one of the issues that we do have in southern Canada, obviously, is fragmentation due to roads crossings, let's call them.
Yeah.
And so the other thing we know is that we can improve crossings to make wildlife movement and water quality better. And, we see it clearly when we drive Highway 1 and you see the overpasses, those amazing overpasses to move animals through Banff and through our different national parks. And they're great, but the same holds true from an aquatic perspective. We have to be able to move animals through from an aquatic perspective. So we do quite a bit of work, and some of them are massive, $1 million plus dam removals. Some of them are tiny, a couple $1,000 and a group of volunteers and shovels, and we can fix the crossing. So
Yeah.
they vary. Some of them are big national projects, some of them are smaller, small group of volunteer-based projects, and everything in between. And it's just about literally reconnecting the habitats, the aquatic habitats in our country.
Does that effort include, I pretty much know the
Mhm.
answer, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. How does it show up in an urban versus rural? Seems like um, obviously rural is a big landscape, but the impacts in a urban landscape could be pretty amazing. How has your programming, whether it's reconnecting, like the barriers piece, like how does it show up in an urban setting?
It's really interesting. When I was just getting into work with Trout Unlimited Canada at the time, my boss at the time, Jack, said, there's an interesting trend. There was a researcher that actually studied this, that if you had kids from an urban environment play around water and you had kids from um, a rural environment play around water, one group 99% of the time dammed up the water with rocks, and one group 99% of the time dug channels to move water. You want to guess which is which?
Well, I'm gonna guess the urban folks were damming it up.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so it's a fundamental measure or a fundamental measure of how we look at water based on where we are, the community we grow up in, and what we do with the water in our communities. And so in rural settings, water is working water, right? It's viewed as working. In urban settings, it's not viewed as working, even though it
Mhm.
is very much so, it's viewed as recreational. And so, yeah, the conversations are different, the projects are different, and the work is very, very different as a result. And so the Reconnecting Canada program is very tough in an urban environment, partially because of the concepts of the view that people have of waterways, but also because of the tight infrastructure, right? We
Yeah.
don't give a lot of room for rivers in particular to move around through a city, and so that becomes a little bit of a challenge when you have a crossing that is a barrier to either animal movement or to water quality. That can happen as well.
Right.
So the urban projects, a little bit more challenging, typically take longer, and take a lot more to get buy-in for, actually.
But you don't shy away from them.
Oh
You
gosh, no.
will get involved if there's something there.
Hmm.
Well, I'm going to be following up with you on that one. I can tell you right now.
You got my
So
number. Give me a
you
call.
betcha. So we've got about 20 minutes or so left. So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to make sure we have a chance to cover some of the questions in the chat, and Jill's going to join us to relay those.
Great.
But I'm thinking, if you were going to provide some advice to NSWA or any organization around an action or a mindset or something that would help us strengthen freshwater conservation, what would you advise?
This is a tough one, because I think, as individuals, we know all the actions we can take. Don't keep the tap running while you're, brushing your teeth, and handle fish properly, keep them wet, keep wheels out of water wherever possible, use designated trails to stop erosion into the streams. There's all these individual actions we can take. At an organization level, it's a little bit different. And I think as organizations, we have an opportunity to have that conversation about evolving the mindset of what our rivers and streams and lakes mean to us beyond recreation, the value they have for our health and well-being. You spoke earlier, Scott, about the ecological goods and services. The ecological goods and services, the list is a mile long. And it's from our health and well-being to our emotional health, our physical health and well-being, to servicing our communities, keeping us alive, literally, to servicing industries, keeping our economy alive. And so I think the biggest thing we can do as organizations is to support people in that conversation and evolving the view of ecosystems as not being out there, but being something we're a part of.
One of the things that we've been doing over the last year and a half or so is we've had a few initiatives, we'll say, where we've been working more closely with Indigenous communities. And I have to say, there's nothing more, I know, fulfilling maybe is the right word, I guess, in terms of being reconnected to some thinking that in most Indigenous people have, that's ingrained in their worldview, that everything is connected and related. And so I think when you talk about that connection, and what they mean to us, it's almost not about teaching people what they mean, or it's about reminding them that they already know. Right. So I think that's a powerful message, and hopefully everybody on the call is paying attention. So Jill, I'm going to turn it to you for a second and see if you have any questions coming out of the chat that Sylvia can touch on.
Sure do. Yeah, don't mind me popping in. There's some great ones in the chat. The first is from our very own Michelle from NSWA. She's wondering, as you mentioned about Alberta being water poor, actually, which she says might be a bit of a surprise for people to hear, and that there is a bit of ongoing work to try to reframe Canada's perspective on how much water we have, and that water being healthy and sustainable water supplies for ongoing economic expansion, population. And I'm wondering what types of messages are being used to help reframe a realistic perspective amongst the public.
That's a really good question. And the term water poor, I mean that relatively. So there's nothing wrong, particularly with southern Alberta. This is the ecosystem as Mother Nature intended it. But I think what we have to reframe is our expectations. So we don't have, I know it's shocking that for a lot of Canadians that I speak to, it's shocking, the idea that we don't have unlimited clean water in this country. We don't. We don't have unlimited, forests, and wild spaces. We don't. And I think it's a little shocking to a lot of Canadians when you actually look at the amount of industry and resource extraction in areas that we don't even know about, right? We used to joke when I worked in Ontario about the ribbons and donuts. Around every river, there's ribbons of green down either side, and around every lake, there's a donut of green, because there's a requirement to keep that buffer. And so because most of us recreate on water bodies, we don't see the extraction, the resource take, the landscape use. And so that becomes really challenging. And it's especially challenging in southern Alberta, in particular, when you're talking to groups like anglers, let's say, that see, their cohorts in BC or in Ontario harvesting large numbers of fish, because there are large numbers of fish and it's sustainable to harvest. And why can't that be done here? Well, quite simply, we just don't have as much. And so reframing the discussion is challenging, because how do you say to people, we just don't have it? Sorry. But a lot of times what we can talk about is what we do have and how we want to value our ecosystems. So if I go back to the angler example, in Southern Alberta, we have fisheries here that don't exist anywhere else. We have experiences here that don't exist anywhere else. So maybe we have an opportunity to reframe the value of that experience. And it doesn't need to be like anywhere else in Canada.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting how a lot of the time you have an area with a lot of agriculture, but also it's relatively more water poor. Especially in Alberta, we see that a bit. So it's a difficult
Challenging.
pivoting though to another question, a little bit more about the structure of water governance in Alberta, and a question about what concerns do you have and what role can FCC play in dealing with changes to the Alberta Water Act? So especially around interbasin water transfers, water allocations, and water quality concerns. But then also adding in here, they're wondering in particular around metallurgical coal mining and proposals in our watersheds in Grand Cache, Athabasca.
Great question. Let me start by putting a caveat in here and say that the mandate of the organization is on the ground work. So our job is to go in and fix things. That being said, wherever we have an opportunity to impact decisions and discussions with the cards that we have to play, we do. And so if we go back to, I'll give the example of the first time the coal policy was removed and then brought back in. We had a really great relationship at that time with some of the political players. And so we used those opportunities to have those discussions repeatedly, to sit down with folks and talk about the impact that was being had, talk about what was actually happening on the landscape, and to be able to have those one-on-one discussions, I think was a significant benefit. I wouldn't say it was the reason that the coal policy was put back in place, but it certainly didn't hurt. And I think it took everyone working in every way they could to see change happen. And so, we don't have the same opportunity right now with what's going on with resource extraction in this province. But like I said, wherever we have a card that we can play, a relationship that we can draw on, we do.
Yeah, I think that public consultation engagement is really important there.
It is.
And yeah, it's an ongoing debate.
Yeah, so I'd basically say it sounds like that's a message for everybody, is you, and I kind of like the idea of this, you play the cards you can play. So for the NSWA, for instance, we can offer knowledge around, like you say, impacts, or we can bring people together to have conversations.
Exactly.
For other organizations, it's different. For individuals, it's different. And I think the message that I'm taking away is everybody needs to play a part, whatever that part is. Yeah.
And it's actually even better if we don't all play the same part.
It is.
If it's tackled from different directions and in different ways, it's more powerful. And so as long as everyone's committed to doing something to improve the situation, we're bound to get somewhere.
Right. Thanks. Back to you, Jill.
Thank you. So next one, it's Michael Pisca's wondering if Silvia has any comments on the effectiveness in practice, not theory, of Alberta's Water for Life framework in conserving freshwater ecosystems, and how their organization would characterize or suggest improving water governance in Alberta.
That's a really good question, and I would have to leave that to Leslie in our department. So I'm not going to speak out of turn on that because I don't have as much experience with it. Leslie does. But I will commit to getting some notes back. And Jill, if you can help connect me with that individual, I will definitely make a point of doing that.
Definitely.
Thank you.
And yeah, for those who don't know, Water for Life strategy, it does actually designate organizations like NSWA and the Alberta Water Council and watershed stewardship groups and a whole host of other kind of directives for water governance in the province.
I know we've been a big part of it, but I can't speak to the effectiveness personally.
Yeah, very fair. It's a very, Alberta specific. So another is from Andre Asselin, actually with the Alberta Water Council. It's wondering, Alberta drought and flood protection. Oh, sorry, that's not a question. That's just some information. Sorry, there's one more. I believe more education in high schools and not just elementary are good to promote education on the negative aspects of Sorry. I don't think that was a question either.
That's
but I
okay.
did see.
Can I jump in there for a second though? Because that
Yeah,
hit
go
a
ahead.
personal point for me. So whoever posted that, thank you. I'm a big believer that, as we're talking about across Canada, there's a lot of talk about education and, reforming education and, curriculums and all of those pieces. Um, I'm a firm believer that we need to start talking about how we interact with our watersheds at a basic level. I used to do talks in classrooms about water and water use, and we would ask simple questions like, does the water that goes in your toilet and the water that comes out of your sink, is that the same water? And I never once in 10 years had a kid say, yes, it's the same water. No, it's clearly different water. Why would you waste drinking water down a toilet? And so these simple basic things, where does our water come from? Every kid should know what water should they live in and where their water comes from and where their sewage goes, right? Because those kids one day will be in, municipalities or will be engineers or will be part of organizations like ours, and will have that basic knowledge to make sure that their communities are part of their ecosystem. And so I think it's something that's absolutely critical to shift the conversation in elementary school to just understand how we're actually part of the ecosystem, and then shift the discussion in post-secondary or in secondary school about the impacts that we're having and how do we fix it. And I think that has to become critical to education in Canada. That's sort of I had to take that opportunity, sorry.
No, that's fantastic, and I reflect that they're across the sort of the suite of watershed groups like the NSWA. We all do education, I guess, youth education in different ways and to different levels. I know, for instance, our sister organization in the Battle River, they help run the Caring for Our Watersheds program, and they're in schools all the time, doing amazing work that for us as an organization doesn't quite fit because we're way more schools and a lot more kids. So it's I'm curious how FC squared kind of plugs into that education piece, the school piece, or do you plug into that piece still?
We're in a period of evolution now when it comes to education. So we used to have curriculum-based programs like the Yellowfish Road program, the Water Educates. The Yellowfish Road program, I think, is almost 40 years old at this stage and been extremely productive in changing the way we look at storm drains and where water moves to. So we have been heavily involved. But I think, the amount of effort that goes into and the amount of time that goes into building these massive curriculum programs and feeding them across the country is huge. And so we're looking at a different way to connect with curriculum, and with teachers and with school boards. And so I don't know what that's going to look like yet, but we'll see.
Well,
And
again,
just a note, I saw someone post that they're doing exactly that in Canmore. Whoever you are, thank you. Way to
yeah,
go.
that would be Camrose, the Battle River. So
Oh,
yeah,
Camrose was it?
yeah.
Sorry. I'm reading
Uh,
too quickly as I go through.
Yeah,
Seeing
no,
them pop
no,
up.
no worries.
Thank
I
you.
mean, I think everybody's striving for that, the most effective way to try and connect with youth. And for us, it's the Youth Water Council, which Jill is one of the leaders. And that's just a small group, but the funny thing is that small group has such reach beyond their group, which is kind of why we're trying that approach. It's really cool.
Yeah.
I want to ask one more question, and then we can start to wrap up. And I'm going back now to the quick conversation we had on sort of the Indigenous piece. And I know we're trying to bring more Indigenous voices into the work we do. And I'm just thinking of, it was yesterday was Truth and Reconciliation Day. It really bring balance to the conversation and be respectful of the knowledge that's been here long before us. I'm curious how or whether FC squared kind of plugs into the Indigenous and traditional knowledge work.
We do. We do, and we partner with First Nations communities wherever we can. And usually they're project centered.
Right.
But I will say, each nation is unique and different, and so we work to the needs and the interests of each nation, and so we've been sort of across the spectrum, and so it really depends on how they're integrated into our projects or how we integrate with them. sometimes on their projects as well. It varies from location to location and nation to nation.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that there's so many similarities between the two our organization and your organization, with different approaches that I think are complementary. So I'm going to let you sort of have the last word, anything you want to share, and then we're going to pass it to Jill to close us out. That's all right. Thank you very much for taking the time. So last words for you, Sylvia.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Jill, and thanks to everybody on the call. And I would just say, you know, with the changing landscape that we're living in and changing society, it's more and more important every day to support organizations like the NSWA, like Freshwater Conservation Canada, and other organizations that are making change on the ground. More needs to get done every day, and so support is always critical. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, Jill, take us away if you want to give us a little sneak peek into maybe our next webinar.
Sure, thank you. And thanks, Sylvia. This has been such a great, insightful conversation. It's nice to have this structure for the webinars. So thank you everyone for joining us. As always, we have our recording and it will be available on our YouTube channel. That's North Sask Watershed Alliance. You can also subscribe to our in-stream newsletter. It comes out at the end of every month, and you'll see information about upcoming webinars and all sorts of other stuff that you can plug into. And follow us on social media at North Sask River on Instagram, North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance on LinkedIn. And for next time, we hope to see you again for November 5th. Of course, it's also on Wednesday. We have Jennifer Jansen, Executive Director of the Alberta Tomorrow Land Use Simulator. It's a really, really cool website and a really good educational opportunity. So we'll be able to look at our watershed's climate outlook, but also land use and the structure of land use in the province and what's going on, especially talking about our human footprint as well. And then on December 3rd, we have Callum McDonald with the Alberta Invasive Species Council. They're doing some really amazing work to combat the spread of aquatic invasives in our province. So that'll be a really great presentation and conversation as well. So with that, I guess we will end the show. And thanks everyone for joining.
Everybody gets 2 minutes of their lunch hour back.